Many of you also might be thinking, well, you know, what's social media got to do with this? Because we can get that information through conventional patient research methods, and you're not incorrect in that assessment. Conventional patient research methods, which BBK also employs in many of our feasibility studies, include things such as focus groups, depth interviews, patient diaries can be used as well. Online surveys can help us start to get more quantitative data in this regard, but also CATIE, or random digit dialing, which CATIE is computer-assisted telephone interviews, and we can start to use all of these different methods to try to aggregate the data we're looking at. Now, this is a really great way of gathering information in certain ways, but it has a lot of weaknesses inherent in it. The strengths of doing this kind of research are that we don't have to ask a whole lot of questions. We just have to ask the right questions, and that's encompassed in data efficiency and specificity. You know, that we can only ask 4 questions if that's all we need to ask, and we can make sure that the content of those questions is relevant to our particular issue at hand. These methods are established. That is to say, they've been done many, many times before, so we know that they are valid, and they provide you with good information. They're also predictable. We know what kinds of information that we're going to extract from these going into the project. And yet, the sort of the yin to the yang here is their weaknesses. Often we see that these kinds of surveys or these kinds of patient research methods produce ambiguous and biased information. And what I mean by that is that bias can be introduced by many different things in these kinds of this kind of methodology. It can be introduced by the structure of the questions. It can be introduced by the interviewer themselves. It can be introduced by the paid nature of data acquisition. Most of the people who provide this information have to be paid, of course. And that's not an exhaustive list, but I think that you get the idea. The scope of this kind of research is often also geographically limited. We have an asterisk there on geographic limitation simply because it's usually limited by cost. You know, as soon as you start to go to multiple regions, multiple countries to gather this information, that the cost of something like this kind of research exponentially balloons. But that usually means that geographically you're limited to one area to aggregate this kind of data. It's also a snapshot of information. That is, a moment in time of information that's pulled from a finite universe of people, rather than an organic, fluid, flexible, free-flowing, that's a lot of F's, free-flowing sense of information over time. It's usually reactive. That is to say, you've got a situation that you are trying to develop surveys or research methodologies for after the fact, and trying to shoehorn these different kind of methodologies into finding out the information that you need. It's usually directional. Again, that has an asterisk by it. Directional meaning that it is generally not quantitative. It's usually more qualitative. It gives you a good sense of whether this information is true or not, but it's never really truly quantitative unless you can start to aggregate a certain number of responses. And maybe online surveys do that, but again, that becomes a function of cost. As soon as you start to want to aggregate enough information, it can become very, very expensive. Costly there as well shows you that each of these methodologies also has rather high price tag associated with it. So if this has a lot of inherent weaknesses involved in it, then maybe there's also another way of pulling or looking at sources of patient-based information that kind of deflects or is the yin to the yang of all of these weaknesses. And is that information out there available for us? And yes, it is. It's in social media. So I'm going to hand over to James Hamilton to talk more about social media itself.
Hi, everyone. This is James Hamilton, leader of BBK's social media group. And as Matt just described, there is a crucial missing dimension from what we have today as the conventional study feasibility model, and that missing dimension is patient-generated data, the needs, perspectives, and motivations of the patients who may wish to participate in the study as expressed by themselves. And there are equally conventional ways to collect that data: surveys, focus groups, dialing methods. But the question then remains is, what is the most efficient and effective way to add that patient-generated data into your study feasibility surveying? And that answer, of course, for us is social media. And by social media, I mean the vast interconnected network of websites where people go to essentially live an online extension of their own personal social lives. Now, if I asked everyone on this call one by one what their definition of social media was, I would probably get as many different answers as there are people here listening to us today. But a very easy way to understand social media as it exists today is exactly what I said. It is an online extension, a different version of people's lives that they live online, facilitated by the online technology we have. And just as trading, exchanging, and comparing healthcare data is a part of everyone's day-to-day lives today, so it is a part of their lives on social media. So before we talk specifically about recruitment feasibility and social media, let's take a second just to appreciate exactly the scope of social media as it's been exploding onto our lives today. Just a snapshot from around the world gives you an idea of exactly how much internet penetration in general and activity on just one major social media channel are keeping pace. Usually what we see around the world is that 1 out of every 2 people in many places like these who are on the internet are also on Facebook. And if they're not on Facebook, 1 out of these 2 people on the internet is on some social media portal. So think of that. In the developed world, we see anywhere up to 85% of people are on the internet, and at least half of those people are also using some kind of social media. But then again, I probably don't need to tell most of the folks on the phone today that internet use has exploded in the recent past. This is all very much established knowledge for us working in healthcare at the moment. The real news story now is the prevalence of social media in people's lives, using it to search for healthcare information online. For us, e-patients are an assumption. We know that people use the internet to search for healthcare resources. Today's revolution is that the e-patients are not just using the internet, they are using social media to answer the healthcare questions they go online to find information about. The fact of the matter is today that while we already know and to search for healthcare information, the great discovery today is that when they cannot find the information they're looking for online, they'll ask someone else to create that content, that information for themselves. And I'll offer you a quote just to kind of summarize this situation from one of the major U.S. research organizations, Susanna Fox. And she stated recently that talking about people Googling for healthcare is very boring. It's old news. Talking about how healthcare is becoming social online is the revolutionary point. People are sharing and critiquing what they find. If they don't find what they need, they will create it. And that today, the natural state of affairs is people using social media to answer their healthcare questions online, to conduct the activities that we once associated and are now quite familiar with e-patients using. Just by way of illustrating that, just from the U.S., and it's very much the same situation, increasingly around the world, you'll see that pretty much anyone who uses the internet to search for healthcare resources is about 3 to 4 times more likely than anyone else to also use social media to answer their healthcare questions online. So if our e-patients are online using social media to answer their healthcare questions, to search for healthcare resources, to talk about their condition, to share information that's relevant to study feasibility, what exactly are they talking about? What is this information they're sharing, trading, and comparing? Now, BBK's experience is many different things. Their experiences with existing treatments, their perspectives on specific diseases, whether it's their own or a loved one's or someone they are caring for, testimonials on healthcare products and companies, if we think that the patients are not talking about certain products, certain companies, just because that discussion has not been sponsored by the company, then we are quite wrong. Latest news in these patients' therapeutic areas of interest. Are there research findings that have just been announced? Is there a major news story being put out across the wire? It gets caught up in social media, passed around quite rapidly and quite actively. Attitudes towards clinical research. People talk about new research in their area. They talk about new opportunities for people who may have very limited treatment options aside from clinical research. And they talk about unmet therapeutic needs. They talk about what they're not getting out of their treatment, out of their healthcare resources. They compare their unmet needs with those of other people, both in their immediate circle of contacts within their country and around the world. Clearly all extremely relevant information, bits of data that we would absolutely love to bring to the fore for any feasibility project. Now, since, as Matt mentioned earlier, it's certainly possible to tease out much of that information slowly and at great expense through conventional methods of gathering patient-generated data. So why go to social media exactly? Well, it has several considerable strengths that strongly recommend it over those conventional methods. One, it's non-incentivized. People volunteer this information that is traded and exchanged around social media. It's geographically diverse. It's spread around the world across dozens, if not hundreds of different portals. It's extraordinarily fluid and flexible. It is not bound to the lifespan or the construction of a single survey. It's perspective. It's out there already. This information is available on the social media ether, there for the taking. And we do not need to wait for a pressing feasibility question to come to our attention before we can go begin gathering useful data off of social media. It is both qualitative and quantitative. The mass of information that's available on social media is pretty staggering. It takes very, very little time to develop a critical mass of data that can give extremely statistically important results. And lastly, it's cost effective. And you'll see an asterisk there in answer to ones we saw on the conventional methods that we discussed a few minutes ago, whereas Matt described as the larger and more inclusive you make a conventional method of gathering patient-generated data, the more inclusive you make your survey, the longer you make it, the more geographical areas you take into account, the more the expense of that method grows exponentially. Social media does quite the opposite. The larger you make it, the larger the patient population you take in within the scope of your social media project, the more the costs of the program become amortized, the more they are, or the less they are limited to a single protocol, to a single group of patients. Now the weaknesses, granted, there are some things to give hesitance to social media. It is nonspecific. It is very difficult to ask specific questions of the people whose information you are gathering off of social media. You are not likely to find a specific answer to whether a diabetes patients with HbA1c of 11% are interested in going to 15 study visits or 17 visits. It is unstructured. It does not have the benefit of the very clearly defined list of questions that you can put on a survey. It is unconventional. It's unpredictable. There are going to be stakeholders who are not entirely comfortable with this new, very innovative method of collecting patient-generated data for feasibility. But at the same time, all of those weaknesses can also be viewed as qualified strengths. They are nonspecific, but they will bring in vast amounts of unexpected and extremely productive data that will never be taken in through a limited survey. It is unstructured. It will not curtail your data or your information based on the answers that can be given to 10, 15, 20, 100 questions on a survey. And it is unconventional. It is unpredictable. It is new. It is very, very explosive in its potential.